In this video, we're going to look at form building, which is the act of building a more complex object from a series of simple forms. So if you're looking at something around your house, imagine something that's fairly complex, it'd be difficult to draw. You can start to imagine that inside of it, there might be the ideas of cylinders, cubes, spheres, pyramids, and cones. So just like any construction method, this can be built in an additive manner. But also, as you start to think of negative areas or spaces in between those major forms, there might be cutaway spots, and this is what's called subtractive form building. So we're going to use a little bit of both as we're looking at our complex objects that you might find around your own home. But in the end, we're going to remind ourselves about those rules that are involved with drawing boxes and drawing pyramids, and later on we're going to have another video to touch upon things like cylinders, cones, and spheres. So to really understand form building, we actually need to go back and look at simple shapes. Those simple shapes being circles, rectangles, and triangles. Each of those will have rules applied to them, but once we understand those simple rules, we can then move them over to a 3D object or a form. What's great about this simplicity is that we can start to already see the connections between the simple shapes. For example, you can fit a circle into a square. When we look at other rules, we can see that there is a symmetry being formed, such as the vertical line that might divide up a circle or a triangle or a square. Furthermore, you can see a series of perpendicular and parallel lines when we look at things like a square. The most obvious connection between shape and form is when we take a 3D version of a circle and a square and turn it into a sphere or a cube. But others become more complicated because we need to use hybrids, such as a square and a circle turning into a cylinder, or a circle and a triangle coming together to form a cone. Or in the case of a pyramid, it is formed by a square and a triangle hybrid. So today we're going to focus mostly on the cubes and pyramids, but we're going to move on to spheres, cylinders, and cones in a companion video. So diving in, let's talk about some of the rules involved in drawing things like cubes or boxes. They are a three-dimensional version of a square or rectangle. And when you look at a square rectangle, it will have parallel and perpendicular lines. So one thing to think about is these families of lines that start to occur. You're going to have three major families, potentially, depending on your point of view. One of those families are going to be the parallel lines, oftentimes seen as verticals within a cube. They're never going to cross, they're going to be following the edge of your paper going straight up and down. Another family is a series of diagonals that are going to be converging lines, and they might start moving towards the left. So you start to think of any line that is shooting towards the left of that box is going to be the second family. And then there might be another one which will be the diagonal lines traveling towards the right side. So instead of drawing one side individually, think of this as groupings. You're looking at the direction and you want to mimic or follow the direction as we have those parallel and converging sets. In the unique case that you're looking at an object straight on, you're still going to have three families. Instead of having verticals and diagonals to the left and diagonals to the right, instead you'll have verticals, horizontals, and those lines that are descending back in space, or they're diagonal because they're moving from near to far. If I'm not mindful of those rules, I start to make some amateur mistakes. With these two boxes that I'm starting to draw, you can see that there's something a little bit strange about the direction in which they're heading. I'm drawing each side by itself, whether it's in a 1-point or 2-point fashion. Otherwise known as looking at a corner or looking at the front of the box. But a common mistake might be that when we draw each side separately, we're not really being mindful of the whole. So I think number one is that we want to lay down a good gesture before you start drawing individual corners and angles themselves. And then number two is to use measuring skills. Use perceptual grid, use unit measuring, use angle measuring. So you can use that to edit your gesture. So returning back to my two cube shapes that I have on my paper, I'm starting to do a couple things. I'm laying down some tick marks on the cube, and I'm starting to divide this into halves. If you have a drawing that's large enough, your halves might turn into thirds or quarters. And it's really just dependent on the size and how much space you have to explore those notions. But this is a medium-sized drawing, so I don't want to fill it with too much information. But I'm building this concept that within this cube, I have what I can feel is like a shelf. So I'm dividing it into half up and down, and then I can divide it into half side to side. I'm really exploring the space. I'm looking for middles. I'm looking for middles on the flat faces. I'm also looking for middles that can happen as I travel up and down those corners. Through that method, I'm building what is not just one box, but it has these quadrants, or areas where it can start adding to or subtracting from those quadrants. The end result is one that looks like a box, but it's been wrapped up in line or wrapped up in some sort of thread. Imagine a present that you'd have, and that present could have some sort of ribbon moving around it, for example. But the main point is, again, I'm using this to explore what I know about that form rather than what I necessarily see. The definition given to these lines that I'm adding onto the boxes is what is known as a mapping line. A mapping line, or otherwise a cross-contour line, is one that can talk about the surface area. How does it feel to the touch? If I were to touch this box in real life, I can move my hand up and down through the center. I can also move my hand side to side, but notice how I'm using straight lines to do this. So with boxes or pyramids, we're going to cover this with mapping lines that feel very straight. They're not going to curve as in later on like a cylinder or a sphere or a cone. So even though this is not a globe, it still acts like a globe. We have a North Pole being the very top center of the piece. We also have lines that travel down and they start to hit the South Pole. And then also like a globe, we have an equator. It just so happens to be one that's really flat, traveling around the middle of our box. Moving on to pyramids. Pyramids are closely related to drawing of boxes. They still have flat edges to them, they just happen to fall back to a single point that's near the North Pole of the piece. A couple ways that you can start drawing a pyramid. One is that you can gesture in a really loose cone, and once you have that cone placed on the paper, we can start building that in a way that it's not round, but it appears more flat. So in this drawing, I'm looking for a couple corners of my pyramid. Once I find the front few corners, then I'm starting to draw inside of the piece to find the back corner, or the parts that I can't see. But just like a drawing of a cone, I'm looking for an axis. I'm looking for something that's going to fall to the middle, the South Pole, and it's also going to hit the North Pole. So I do make sure that those are completely vertical from each other. And just like I would in a box, I look for families of lines, those that are going to run up to the North Pole, and those are going to run to the left diagonally and then to the right diagonally. The other way that you can draw a pyramid is you can start by gesturing in, again, the size and shape, but then start drawing a box around it. So in this way, you look for the base, you look for the flat planes that would be surrounding your pyramid, and then over time you find the middle of the top of the box, the North Pole, and then once that's found, drawing straight lines from the corners back up to the top. What's nice about these two methods is that they're interchangeable. So you can use one way to double check another. So if you draw a cone first, then you can start drawing a box around it. Or if you were to find the box way first, you can fit a cylinder or a cone inside of it. So again, think of these as packages where you can always fit a cup inside of a box. You can fit a cone inside of a cup. You can fit a pyramid inside of a box. But you use one to double check the accuracy of the other. Of those two methods, I personally prefer drawing a cone first. The reason for this is by drawing a cone, I can make sure that my triangular shape is going to be even. It's not falling over from side to side. Where if you were to draw a box, you have to make sure that that box is well structured, and sometimes you can find out a little bit too late that it's tipping over to the left or to the right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start my drawing that's in the classroom. The first thing I do is I consider how much paper and size and shape I want to utilize. So this object I want to draw as large as possible without it going off the page. I'm using gesture a lot because it is a complex object. It's not like I'm drawing multiple objects, I'm drawing one singular object, but I still treat it the same way. I think a lot about the overall height, overall width, how my eyes might move back and forth between the left and right and top and bottom. Once I have a gesture, I'm going to start using some analytical methods, just like my earlier sketches of those boxes. I'm looking for families of lines. In this particular case, the families of lines that I'm looking for would be verticals, diagonals that are traveling to the left, and then diagonals that are traveling to the right. I do keep in mind that it's probably not going to be perfect. So to put down a line once and to leave it alone is probably going to cause some errors or problems in your drawings. So put down a line very light and allow yourself to be able to change it if it doesn't look correct along the way. And I am doing a lot of perceptual grid, I'm doing a lot of unit measuring. Even though we're moving on to form building, try not to get wrapped up with that idea within the first 10, 20, 30 minutes even. Just draw it as you see it. But eventually you can start using those ideas of sculpture or three-dimensionality in your work. Here I want to point out I'm starting some form building. I've begun finding the middles of the lines. I'm starting to draw connections between the legs and those other families that I talked about earlier. At the same time, I'm beginning to also refine my drawing. So even though I have it laid down, I'm not just doing form building only. I'm going to pull the lines through, look for exit points if they were to keep going on, And I'm checking the accuracy and using form building as a way to help along in that effort. Now I'm about 2/3 into the drawing. I'm going to start thinking about level finish and line weight. Line weight is one way that I can show deeper space in a drawing by using contrast. So an area that's closer to me, like the front legs, will be darker, they'll be more pronounced, where the back legs and the back of the chair is going to be lighter and looser, maybe even more gestural. The chair that I'm drawing has a lot of natural mapping lines. These wooden extensions that move between the legs, for example, the legs themselves, the backing of the chair. So there's not a lot of room for me to add in some of those mapping lines I talked about earlier. But if you have an object that is really flat and more opaque, then that's where see-through drawing will still happen. It's going to inform the viewer about the overall three-dimensionality of the object. But also feel free to add in some of those latitude and longitude remarks. As a reminder of why we're doing this, it's not just drawing what we see. It's about investigation and hoping to find something new as artists that we might not otherwise if we're not drawing this object. It allows us to slow down and find some things that we might glance over if we're encountering this in an everyday setting. And I think that's really the joy, is that we can find some sort of like deeper involvement in how this object is built, the design qualities, and some of the ingenuity that goes in making it, knowing that there's something really structurally sound occurring within its overall form. In the final drawing, along with line weight that we talked about earlier, it's a good idea to make sure that you have some of those extensions of lines. And those extensions of lines, as you can see on the left side of my drawing, will start to become the negative space. So we're not just drawing the object, we're drawing the enclosement around it. In this case, it's a slightly larger box that can fit like a package or box around our chair. And then finally, as an extra measure, step away from your drawing. Look at it from a distance and imagine yourself in a critique situation where you're looking at this from 5 or 10 feet away. And while you're doing that, feel free to squint, look for information that's happening below, like gesture and measuring, so that you're not too focused on the final lines or the outside lines that you see for the form. It's really that you want that mix of early drawing, later drawing, and everything that happens in between. So it's okay to add this in retroactively if you see some measurements or if you see some connections that you might have overlooked in the beginning. So go back and look for halves, look for quarters, look for thirds, and then find those connections that can happen between the unrelated objects. But this is really the start of drawing these more complex objects that you can always add in things like text or pattern, and it's going to follow some of the same moves that we're doing here. So it has a nice segue into both invented and objects that we encounter in our everyday lives.